Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight, we'll trace the entire story of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. On an April evening in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped onto a motel balcony in Memphis, and a single gunshot ended his life. Within hours, his family, his friends, and people who had marched with him were left in shock, grieving the man they had looked to for courage and direction. Across the country, grief and anger spilled into the streets. Protests and uprisings broke out in dozens of cities, and Americans wondered what would happen to the civil rights movement and to the promise of equality without his voice. We'll take our time and keep an easy pace. We'll stay close to the people who lived through it and to the quiet ways this assassination still shows up in American life today. Before we begin, if you find comfort in calm retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, you're welcome to subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, settle back, and let the rest of the day drift while we ease into tonight's story. Before we stay on that balcony in Memphis, we need to step back for a while and walk through the years that led up to it to see what everyday life felt like under the weight of segregation and slow change. Only by tracing that longer road can we understand how the shot that ended one man's life could shake an entire country already stretched, divided, and searching for a different future. MLK's assassination sits at the far edge of a long story about the United States in the years after World War II, when segregation was still written into daily life and quiet resistance was beginning to grow louder. Across the South, signs on doors and drinking fountains told Black Americans where they were not welcome. White officials defended these lines as tradition and order. Many families simply tried to endure, building churches, schools, and neighborhoods where they could feel some measure of safety and dignity. In big northern cities, the picture looked different but carried many of the same pressures. Black workers moved into factory jobs and crowded apartment blocks, often finding that unwritten rules and quiet refusals kept them from better pay and safer streets. Patrol cars watched certain corners more closely than others, and landlords drew invisible borders on city maps. The legal structure that held this in place was called Jim Crow. Courts allowed segregated schools and buses so long as they were supposedly equal, though anyone walking through a worn schoolhouse door in a black neighborhood could see the difference. Underneath the legal arguments lay fear, habit, and an old belief that one group should sit above another. In the mid-20th century, the Supreme Court began to chip away at that structure, and national news carried images of students walking into white schools under the watch of federal troops. For some Americans, this felt like long-delayed justice. For others, it felt like a threat to a way of life they had been taught not to question. At kitchen tables and church gatherings, people argued quietly about what change would mean. Black parents wondered how far they could push before backlash landed on their children. White parents worried about crime or disruption and often did not see the quiet burden the system placed on their neighbors. The country shared streets, but not always the same picture of fairness. In this world, televisions and radios played a growing role, A march in one southern town could now be watched from living rooms in Chicago or Los Angeles. Images of peaceful protesters pushed by police or hit by water from fire hoses unsettled many viewers. Others focused on broken windows after demonstrations and asked why order could not simply be enforced. The Cold War added another layer to this tension. American leaders wanted to present the country as a model of freedom in contrast to the Soviet Union. Yet photographs of segregated buses and barred schoolhouse doors appeared in foreign newspapers. Civil rights activists knew this and sometimes reminded officials that their calls for justice also protected the nation's image abroad. For black families in the South, these large debates trace back to small details. A mother might walk her child past a nicer park where they could not sit on the benches. A father might wait at a back door to pick up an order he had paid for in full. The lessons of where one could stand or speak were taught early and often. At the same time, black churches and community centers offered places where a different message could be heard. In these spaces, pastors and organizers reminded people that they were children of God and citizens of a nation that had promised equality on paper. Hymns and speeches stitched hope together with patience. Young people listened and wondered how long patience could last. White resistance had many faces. Some local leaders used polite language while working quietly to delay new laws. Others joined groups that marched with open symbols of hate and threatened anyone who spoke out. Behind them stood long networks of friends, employers, and sheriffs who might not attend a rally, but still chose not to interfere. Federal agencies watched the growing civil rights movement with mixed feelings. Some officials wanted to protect activists and enforce court orders. Others feared unrest and worried that strong action would drive Southern politicians away from the National Party. Within that tension, files were opened, phone lines tapped, and detailed reports on movement leaders placed in quiet drawers. The early 1960s brought new waves of activism. Students sat at lunch counters and waited calmly as they were refused service. Riders boarded interstate buses and refused to move when told to change seats. Each act of quiet refusal pulled more attention to the gap between American promises and daily experience. At the center of many scenes stood young organizers, ministers, and volunteers whose names would never appear in history books. They filled clipboards in church basements, printed handbills at kitchen tables, and knocked on doors until their feet ached. Some were afraid every day yet kept going. Others found a kind of calm inside the work itself. In Washington, presidents and members of Congress could not fully ignore what they were seeing. Police dogs lunging at children made for stark photographs. So did neatly dressed marchers walking through the nation's capital to ask for basic rights. Yet each new piece of legislation required bargaining, delay, and a careful reading of how white voters might react. By the mid-1960s, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act had reshaped the law. On paper, barriers that had stood for generations were struck down. In practice, habits and patterns did not vanish overnight. Employers could still choose whom to promote. Banks could still decide which neighborhoods to support, and police could still decide whom to stop. In many white neighborhoods, there was a sense that enough change had already taken place. People pointed to new laws and said progress had been made. When further marches were planned, they asked why activists could not simply accept the gains and move on. For black families still facing poor housing, weak schools, and dangerous jobs, that answer felt thin. The war in Vietnam deepened these divides. Young men were drafted from crowded urban blocks and rural towns, sent across the ocean, and sometimes returned in flag-covered coffins. Television brought jungle firefights into homes already strained by debates over race and poverty. Many Black Americans looked at casualty lists and unemployment lines and asked who bore the greatest burdens. Great Society programs promised to address poverty through education, housing, and healthcare. New offices opened, forms were handed out, and community meetings were held in school gyms. Some families saw real help in food support or medical care. Others found that the new programs were hard to reach, slow to respond, or shaped by officials who did not fully understand local needs. Urban unrest began to flare in this atmosphere. When incidents of police violence occurred, patience that had been stretched thin often snapped. Crowds gathered on corners, angry words were exchanged, and sometimes windows were broken. Within hours, entire neighborhoods might be wrapped in smoke, with sirens echoing and families huddled in back rooms, unsure what would come next. Presidential commissions studied these uprisings and released thick reports. They pointed to joblessness, discrimination, and heavy-handed policing as deep causes. Their pages carried careful language, yet painted a picture of communities feeling cornered. Still, many commentators chose to focus mostly on the broken glass, the burned cars, and the lost storefronts that had marked the streets. As the 1960s moved forward, a split grew within the broader civil rights world. Some groups continued to stress nonviolence and patient legal work. Others voiced a sharper demand for black power and community control over schools, housing, and police. Young people in particular tested new slogans and symbols, tired of waiting for distant institutions to change. In many white households, these images produced unease and resentment. Nightly news showed clenched fists, large demonstrations, and campus protests. Some viewers stopped listening to the words and heard only anger. Politicians noticed this shift and began to speak about law and order, promising to restore calm streets without talking as much about the reasons those streets had grown tense. All of this formed the backdrop for local struggles like the one in Memphis. In that city, black sanitation workers lifted heavy trash barrels for low wages and little respect. They worked in the rain without proper gear and could be sent home without pay. When two workers were crushed in a faulty truck, grief and anger spilled into the open. The men carried signs reading, "I am a man," and marched through downtown streets. Their demand was simple respect along with safer conditions and fair wages. Yet to city leaders, the strike felt like both an economic and political challenge. They worried that if these workers succeeded, others would follow, and the carefully managed order of the city would shift. Police met the marches with clubs and tear gas, and local newspapers covered the clashes with a wary eye. In black neighborhoods, the strike became a symbol of long-delayed recognition. In many white homes, it was seen as another sign that the world was changing too quickly. Between these views, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. By the time national attention turned to Memphis, King was known in every corner of the country as a pastor who spoke of non-violence and justice. Supporters saw him as a steady moral voice. Critics saw him as a disturber of peace, especially after he spoke against poverty and the war. Whispered conversations and public speeches alike carried talk of danger. Some extremists openly wished him harm. Law enforcement files recorded threats and rumors, measuring the risk while still surveilling him as a possible source of unrest. Around him, security tightened in small ways, but could never fully close the distance. On the streets of Memphis and across the nation, the stage was set. Old laws had fallen, but old hatreds remained. Crowded rallies and tense meetings filled the days, as one spring evening on a motel balcony slowly approached. MLK's assassination can only be understood by walking back through Martin Luther King Jr.'s path from a young pastor in Atlanta to a weary national leader standing in the hard light of 1968. He was born in 1929 into a house filled with sermons, music, and the steady routines of a black middle-class family that carried both comfort and constraint. His father preached from the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church. His mother played the organ, and the young Martin watched how faith could shape the pace of a neighborhood. Outside their doors, Atlanta still kept its color lines, and the boy who read scripture at the dinner table learned early which movie entrances and streetcars were meant for him. Inside that home, education was treated as a shield and a key. King skipped grades, entered college young, and found himself drawn to questions about justice and the deepest meaning of love. He read theologians who spoke of a God who sided with the poor, and he studied the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, who had used non-violent resistance to challenge British rule in India. These ideas did not yet point to marches on southern streets, but they settled quietly in his mind and waited. King went on to seminary and then to doctoral studies in the north, where he walked through cities that felt different from Atlanta, but carried many of the same invisible barriers. He met classmates from around the world, argued late into the night about faith and ethics, and learned how the language of philosophy could sit beside simple church hymns. He also fell in love with Coretta Scott, a gifted musician and determined thinker in her own right, and together they imagined a life of shared purpose. By the early 1950s, King accepted a call to serve as pastor in Montgomery, Alabama. The church he entered was proud, orderly, and rooted in a community that knew both the comfort of Sunday worship and the sting of weekday humiliation on segregated buses and sidewalks. King hoped to preach thoughtful sermons, conduct weddings and funerals, and help his congregation move through the familiar cycle of seasons. History, however, was moving toward his front door. The spark came when local black citizens, long tired of being pushed to the back of buses or off their seats, organized a protest after the arrest of Rosa Parks. Community leaders searched for someone young, educated, and relatively unknown to chair a new committee. King was hesitant, yet agreed. Within days, he found himself speaking to crowded church basements where workers and maids sat on wooden pews and folding chairs, listening for a plan that could hold them together. During the Montgomery bus boycott, King stepped fully into the role of movement leader. He visited mass meetings, encouraged people with simple stories, and reminded them that non-violence was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. Each day brought fresh tests, from threats on his phone to the bombing of his home while his wife and baby daughter were inside. Standing on the damaged porch afterward, he urged the angry crowd not to answer violence with more violence, and many listeners never forgot that moment. The boycott lasted more than a year. People walked long distances rather than ride the buses. Carpools formed before sunrise, with drivers packing cars full of neighbors heading to work. When a Supreme Court decision finally struck down bus segregation in Montgomery, King had become a national figure and a symbol of what organized, disciplined nonviolence could achieve. After Montgomery, King and other ministers formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, often shortened to SCLC. Their goal was to coordinate campaigns across the South, relying on local churches as both meeting space and moral anchor. King's days filled with travel, speeches, and planning sessions, where exhausted volunteers ate sandwiches over maps and schedules. The work was inspiring yet grinding, and he began to live with constant tension between time on the road and time with his family. As the 1960s unfolded, King and SCLC turned to more challenging targets. In Birmingham, Alabama, they confronted a city notorious for violent resistance to change. Local children joined marches, singing as they walked. Police turned fire hoses and dogs on them, and the images spread quickly through newspapers and television, reaching homes far from the South. King spent time in jail, writing about a moral duty to resist unjust laws and urging white moderates not to confuse order with justice. The Birmingham campaign helped build momentum for the March on Washington in 1963. King and other leaders gathered hundreds of thousands of people at the Lincoln Memorial, where he delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech in a voice that sounded both firm and hopeful. He spoke of a nation that might one day live out its promise of equality and of children who would be judged by character rather than skin color. For many viewers, this moment fixed him in memory as a kind of national preacher. In the years that followed, King helped push for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, marching in Selma and meeting with presidents who needed his moral authority, yet sometimes feared his pressure. Awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, he traveled to Oslo and accepted the honor not as a personal victory, but as recognition of a larger movement. Back home, he walked through neighborhoods where clean water, safe housing, and meaningful jobs were still in short supply, and he began to speak more directly about economic injustice. By the mid-1960s, King turned some of his attention to cities outside the South, including Chicago. There he found slum apartments with peeling paint and broken windows, families paying high rents for neglected spaces, and children playing near alleys stacked with trash. Marches through white neighborhoods were met with jeers, thrown objects, and angry signs. King remarked that he had seen hatred in the North that shocked him, a reminder that segregation and hostility were not confined to one region. As his message expanded, the political climate around him shifted. Younger activists in groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee grew more skeptical of integrationist dreams and called instead for black power and community control. Some respected King, yet felt his approach was too slow or too tied to white approval. King listened to these critiques, worried about growing divisions, and tried to hold together a broad coalition even as the ground under his feet seemed to move. King also made a fateful decision to speak out against the war in Vietnam. At a major speech in New York in 1967, he described the conflict as a moral disaster that drained resources from programs to fight poverty and sent poor and black soldiers to die far from home. Many political allies urged him to stay focused on civil rights legislation. Newspapers that once praised him now criticized his stance, yet he felt that silence would make him unfaithful to his own message. All the while, surveillance around King tightened. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under J. Edgar Hoover, had long monitored him, tapping phones and recording meetings. Officials tried to portray him as a threat, questioning his alliances and personal life. Anonymous letters arrived with cruel suggestions that he end his own life. These pressures weighed heavily on him and those closest to him, even as he continued to stand in pulpits and on platforms urging others not to give in to fear. By 1967 and early 1968, King was deeply tired, yet still planning new campaigns. He and SCLC designed the Poor People's Campaign, which would bring a broad coalition of low-income Americans to Washington to demand jobs, housing, and a living wage. The vision was not just about race, but about the shared struggle of those left on the margins of a wealthy society. Organizing such an effort required endless meetings, travel, and negotiation with local leaders and national officials. In this period, King's sermons took on an even more reflective tone. He spoke about the cost of leadership, about climbing lonely hills, and about the possibility that his own life might be cut short. Congregations listened in silence as he described a world where the moral arc of the universe bent toward justice, yet could be painfully long. After services, friends noticed the fatigue in his eyes and the weight in his shoulders, even when his voice sounded strong. When news of the Memphis sanitation strike reached him, King saw it as part of the same struggle at the heart of the Poor People's Campaign. Here were men doing some of the hardest work in the city for low wages and little protection, carrying bags that leaked and riding trucks that sometimes failed in deadly ways. Their sign, "I'm a man," spoke directly to the themes he had carried for years. Dignity, fair pay, and human worth were all bound together on those streets. He agreed to travel to Memphis, even as advisors worried about his schedule and his safety. Earlier visits had already brought challenges, including a march that ended in broken windows and the death of a young man shot by police. King felt the weight of that loss and the criticism that followed. Yet he remained convinced that non-violent discipline could still guide the movement there. By the time he checked into the Lorraine Motel in early April 1968, King's life story had braided together spiritual calling, intellectual training, public courage, and private strain. The rooms around him held aides working late on speeches, strategy, and travel plans. Outside, local supporters watched the comings and goings of reporters, ministers, and city officials. Everything that would unfold on that balcony stood on years of choices, risks, and convictions that had slowly drawn a single man into the center of a nation's struggle. MLK's assassination unfolded against the backdrop of a tense spring in Memphis, where the sanitation strike had drawn local pain into national view. Beneath that public crisis lay years of small insults, hard labor, and quiet organizing that shaped what those streets felt like in early 1968. To understand the strike and the man who came to stand with it, we have to step carefully through that city's daily life. In the late 1960s, Memphis sat on the edge of the Mississippi River, with bright downtown offices and long streets of small wooden houses stretching away from the water. Segregation shaped where people lived, where they worked, and which doors they used when they entered a public building. Many white residents knew the sanitation department as a line item in a budget and the sound of trucks in the early morning, not as men lifting dripping metal tubs by hand in the rain. The sanitation workers were mostly black men who rode on the backs of old trucks, wrestling heavy cans and loose trash in every kind of weather. Their pay barely covered rent and food. They had no real safety rules to protect them, and there were no showers or clean uniforms waiting at the end of a long shift. On rainy days, supervisors sometimes sent them home without pay, and many men took on second jobs just to keep families afloat. The work was not only dangerous, but humiliating in ways that cut deep and quiet. Garbage leaked onto shoes and coats. The smell clung to skin and hair, and workers sometimes went home to children who pulled away from the odor before moving in for a hug. White supervisors used their power to decide who worked overtime, who kept a job after a mistake, and who was sent home early when the trucks broke down. For years before the spring of 1968, the men had talked quietly about forming a union that could speak with one voice for better wages, safety, and respect. T.O. Jones, a determined worker with a calm manner, pushed again and again for organizing, even when city officials punished him with suspensions and firings. By the late 1960s, their union, AFS-CME Local 1733, existed on paper, but the city refused to recognize it as a partner at the bargaining table. Henry Loeb, the mayor of Memphis, saw himself as a firm guardian of city finances and authority, and believed unions would only bring disorder. He spoke of the workers almost as children who needed his care, while insisting that he alone had the right to make final decisions about pay and conditions. At City Hall, supporters praised his toughness and his calm tone in press conferences, while in black neighborhoods, his name was said with a mix of anger, disbelief, and weary humor. On a rainy day in early February 1968, two workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, climbed into the back of a truck to escape a sudden downpour that soaked their thin clothes. A faulty compactor switch engaged, the metal jaws closed, and by the time the machine stopped, both men were gone. News of the accident passed from house to house that night, traveling through church phone trees and corner conversations until it settled over whole blocks like a heavy cloud. The city offered small death payments that could not begin to match the loss of husbands, fathers, and friends. To many workers, the gesture felt like proof that their lives were seen as cheap, their risk invisible, and their pain something to be managed quietly. At funerals, pastors spoke softly about dignity and justice, while mourners looked at the coffins and thought about the trucks still rolling through the neighborhoods each dawn. Within days, the long, simmering talk of a strike turned into firm plans. On February 12th, more than 900 of the city's 1,100 sanitation workers stayed home, leaving garbage to pile up in alleys and backyards and on curbs across Memphis. By the end of the week, thousands of tons of refuse had gathered in low hills, drawing flies and stray dogs and worrying families who saw health as well as pride at stake. Each day, the strikers gathered at Claiborne Temple, a historic black church, for noon meetings that felt part rally and part family gathering. They prayed, sang, listened to speeches, and then marched downtown carrying hand-lettered signs that stated in simple words what the men wanted the city to see. Those signs read, "I am a man," a short sentence that pushed back against years of being called boy or worse by bosses who never had to lift a dripping can themselves. Women in the community played a crucial role, cooking meals for meetings, watching children while their fathers marched, and raising money through church offerings and small donations. Teenagers passed out leaflets, practiced songs, and watched closely as older men and women debated strategy in hallways and at kitchen tables. In many homes, there was worry about missed paychecks, yet there was also a quiet sense that this moment might finally force the city to look them in the eye. The city responded with a mix of legal pressure and physical force. Police in helmets and long coats lined the routes of the marches, carrying clubs and cans of mace, and people learned to brace themselves when sirens drew close. On some days, officers swung their clubs, sprayed gas, and pushed demonstrators to the pavement, leaving bruises, cuts, and a dull ache that lasted long after the crowds went home. Local white newspapers often framed the story as one of law and order against unruly workers, praising Mayor Loeb for standing firm while describing outside supporters as troublemakers. Black newspapers and church bulletins told a different story, one of men asking simply to be treated as workers whose labor mattered and whose bodies deserved protection. In living rooms across the city, televisions showed both versions, and viewers chose which picture to trust based on long habits and quiet fears. As the strike dragged on, national union leaders and civil rights figures began to arrive in Memphis, adding their voices and their experience to the struggle. Representatives from AFSCME's national office flew in to advise Local 1733, and leaders from the NAACP and other groups spoke at rallies that filled church pews to the doors. They reminded the workers that their fight was part of a wider push for human dignity, even as they knew that each passing day without pay made the choice to continue harder. White business leaders watched from a careful distance, worried about uncollected garbage and nervous customers, yet often reluctant to challenge the mayor in public. Some spoke quietly in private meetings, urging a compromise, while others believed that giving in to the workers would open the door to more demands from other city employees. In the meantime, ordinary store owners along the march routes swept their sidewalks in the morning and watched crowds pass in the afternoon, wondering how long this tension could last. When word spread that Martin Luther King Jr. might come to support them, many workers felt a new rush of energy mingle with the fatigue in their bones. They had seen him on television, leading marches in other cities, heard recordings of his sermons, and watched his name appear in newspaper headlines about civil rights and peace. The idea that he would step into their struggle made the fight in Memphis feel connected to a larger promise that the whole nation was watching. King arrived in Memphis in March and spoke at Bishop Charles Mason Temple, a large sanctuary whose pews and balconies filled until people stood along the walls and in the aisles. Outside, rain beat against the roof, while inside, his voice rose and fell, thanking the workers for their courage and tying their stand to the wider struggle for justice across the country. He reminded them that they were children of God and full citizens whose labor held the city together, and he urged them to stand firm in non-violence even when provoked. That night, he called for a massive march and hinted at a city-wide work stoppage, suggesting that ministers, teachers, and other workers might stay home for a day to show their support. The crowd answered with shouts and applause, the sound rising up into the rafters of the old church, while outside the rain continued to fall on dark streets and overflowing trash cans. In moments like that, the strike felt not only like a dispute over wages, but like a doorway into a different kind of Memphis where every worker would count. Plans were laid for a big march on March 28th, with students excused from school, workers leaving jobs where they could, and church groups lining up behind banners and handmade signs. When the day came, the crowd was larger and younger than many organizers expected, with long lines of teenagers and children walking behind the older workers in the front. King arrived late, stepped into the march, and soon realized that the lines were hard to control. The mood was unsettled, and some young men at the back were ready for confrontation. As the march moved through downtown, a group at the rear began breaking windows and pulling items from storefronts, and within moments, police rushed in with clubs and gas, swinging and firing into the dust and shouts. People ran in different directions, some trying to shield children, others pressed against walls or cars, while tear gas spread in white clouds that stung eyes and throats. By the time the streets began to clear, hundreds had been arrested, dozens were hurt, and a 16-year-old boy named Larry Payne lay dead after being shot by police in a housing project courtyard. King was rushed away from the march in a waiting car, listening in silence as aides described shattered glass, injured neighbors, and the teenager who had died. In the days that followed, with a court order limiting protests, he wrestled with doubt, yet chose to return to Memphis and help guide the strike toward peace. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination drew near as Martin Luther King Jr. returned to Memphis for a final visit to the Lorraine Motel, trying once more to steady a fragile campaign. The city felt familiar to him now, yet every doorway and corner also carried the memory of recent marches that had ended in chaos and grief. Inside his small circle, there was a sense that the days ahead in Memphis could either renew his strategy or break it apart. The Lorraine Motel itself stood on Mulberry Street, a low building painted in pale colors with parking spaces in front and 2 levels of rooms connected by an open balcony. It was a Black-owned business that hosted musicians, salesmen, and families who needed a place where they knew they would be treated as guests instead of problems. For King and his team, the Lorraine had become a kind of way station, close to churches and meeting halls, yet quiet enough for late-night planning over coffee and papers. On the morning of April 3rd, heavy storms rolled across the region, and the plane carrying King from Atlanta to Memphis sat delayed on the runway while thunder cracked in the distance. A report of a bomb threat led to a careful search of the aircraft, and as passengers waited, some glanced at King and quietly weighed what his presence might mean. Stories of threats were not new to him by 1968, yet each one pressed a little more weight onto days that were already full of expectation and strain. When the search ended and the plane finally lifted off, rain streaked the windows and the engines carried everyone through rough air toward a city that was watching his every move. At the airport in Memphis, local supporters and reporters met him with umbrellas and notepads, guiding him quickly toward waiting cars that would return him to the Lorraine. Inside the Lorraine Motel that day, staff straightened bedspreads, wiped tables, and tried to keep up with the flow of guests who came and went as part of the strike effort. Room 306, where King stayed, looked out over the parking lot and the small pool, a simple space with 2 beds, a desk, and a television where news could be watched between meetings. Owner Walter Bailey moved quietly through the property, honoring King's request for some privacy, while also helping manage the steady stream of visitors who hoped for a moment of conversation. For those who worked there, it was still a business day, with phones ringing at the front desk and towels to be folded in the laundry room, even as history gathered just outside the doors. Within King's team, there was still debate about how deeply he should stay involved in Memphis after the troubled march at the end of March. Some advisors worried that another attempt at a big demonstration might end the same way, with broken windows, police violence, and another young life lost. Others argued that walking away would tell the Memphis workers and the wider movement that the forces resisting change could simply push hard enough and make national leaders retreat. In meetings at the Lorraine and in nearby churches, voices rose and fell as people weighed their fear of further violence against their belief that non-violent pressure still had power. King listened, asked questions, and often sat quietly for long moments before speaking, his fingers resting on his chin as if he were holding both the movement and his own family in mind. In the afternoon of April 3rd, plans for the Poor People's Campaign mixed with Memphis, details on chalkboards and notepads scattered across the motel room. King and his colleagues sketched routes for a future march, talked about how to keep lines disciplined, and weighed the involvement of local youth whose frustration and energy both worried and inspired them. Television news in the background carried images of protests, Vietnam footage, and campaign events in a heated election year, reminding everyone that Memphis was only one stage in a restless country. Phone calls came and went, with local ministers updating King on the mood in neighborhoods and union leaders sharing how long their members could keep going without pay. As evening approached, rain still pounded Memphis, and many assumed that the mass meeting planned for Bishop Charles Mason Temple would be lightly attended or perhaps even cancelled. King was tired, fighting a cold, and for much of the late afternoon, he stayed at the Lorraine, while Ralph Abernathy and other aides considered starting the meeting without him. They knew he drew crowds and shaped headlines, but they also saw the weariness in his face and heard the strain in his voice when he coughed or laughed. At Mason Temple, however, people kept arriving despite the storm, filling pews and balconies with coats dripping and umbrellas folded along the aisles. Organizers phoned the Lorraine to say that the church was packed and that the crowd expected to hear from King himself, not simply from his closest colleagues. Responding to those calls, King pulled himself together at the Lorraine Motel, put on a suit, and headed through the rain toward Mason Temple, with members of his team riding alongside him. Inside the church, the atmosphere felt electric and expectant, with choirs singing, fans waving in the humid air, and workers standing shoulder to shoulder near the front. Ralph Abernathy began the evening, but when King entered the building, applause rolled through the sanctuary, and people stood, some with tears already in their eyes. He spoke for more than 40 minutes, linking the Memphis struggle to the larger fight against poverty and war, and returned again to the idea that dangerous times called for steady, organized courage. Near the end, he described seeing the progress already made, spoke of reaching the promised land of greater justice, and acknowledged that he might not live to walk there with the people listening to him. The congregation answered with shouts, amens, and bursts of applause, feeling that something unusually heavy and hopeful was being laid before them on that storm-soaked night. After the speech, King and his friends moved slowly back out into the rain, answering quick questions from reporters and offering brief handshakes and smiles to people waiting along the path. Back at the Lorraine, the group gathered in room 306 and nearby rooms, eating a late meal of simple food, replaying lines from the speech, and talking about next steps. Some were struck by the way he had talked about death and destiny, while others focused more on logistical details like permits, maps, and the role of federal mediators. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, and the lights of the motel cast soft reflections on the wet pavement where cars sat quiet for the night. King eventually lay down to rest, though sleep came slowly, with phone calls to and from his wife Coretta in Atlanta, weaving through the late hours. They talked about family routines, the children, and the ongoing work, mixing ordinary concerns with the knowledge that his schedule kept him moving from city to city. At the Lorraine Motel outside his door, security volunteers and staff stayed awake, watching the entrance and the parking lot as best they could with the modest resources they had. In other rooms, younger workers played cards, shared stories, and tried to shake off the chill of the stormy day before finally turning out the lights. The morning of April 4th in Memphis began quietly at the Lorraine, with housekeeping staff moving their carts along walkways and the smell of breakfast drifting from the kitchen. King met with aides over eggs, coffee and orange juice, going through the day's schedule and reviewing talks with city officials and federal mediators about the next march. Reports suggested that progress was possible, that a peaceful route might be agreed upon, and that the city could be persuaded to accept a demonstration under strict non-violent guidelines. Between meetings, King took calls from supporters in other cities, pastors planning to bring delegations for the Poor People's Campaign, and organizers juggling travel, housing, and media requests. Around midday, he stepped outside for fresh air and spoke with onlookers who had gathered near the parking lot, taking time to shake hands, answer brief greetings, and pose for a few photographs. Children from the neighborhood watched from a distance or waved when they saw him leaning on the balcony rail, his figure already familiar from news images and magazines. Inside, aides continued to rotate through the room with updates from City Hall, from Claiborne Temple, and from Union headquarters, each report adding another piece to a fragile sense of momentum. King's mood shifted between light conversation and thoughtful silence as he joked with friends one moment and then stared out the window, absorbed in private reflection the next. During the afternoon, he met with a small group of local leaders and National Union staff in a conference room away from the motel, talking through practical steps for an agreement and the importance of keeping the strike nonviolent. Federal mediator James Lawson and others helped frame possible compromises, noting where the city might bend on wages, job security, and recognition of the union without appearing to surrender authority. For King, these sessions showed that the Memphis struggle still had a path forward, that the sacrifices of the workers might lead to real gains rather than a stalled confrontation. When the meeting ended, he returned again to the Lorraine, where reporters waited for a brief press availability and workers still hoped for a smile or a word of encouragement. Later that afternoon, plans were set for dinner at the home of Reverend Billy Kiles, a local pastor who had walked beside the strike from its first days. In room 306, King dressed slowly, choosing a dark suit while he chatted with aides moving in and out of the doorway. From the courtyard below, Jesse Jackson and others called up with playful remarks about clothes and schedules, drawing a brief laugh as King adjusted his collar and walked toward the balcony rail. Evening light softened. MLK's assassination came out of a few quiet minutes on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel as evening settled over Memphis. The storm had passed, the air felt cool, and the parking lot below held a few cars and knots of friends talking softly. King stepped outside, ready for dinner. Inside room 306, his dinner companions waited and joked, still tying shoes and straightening ties. They had spent the day in long meetings about marches and negotiations, minds crowded with permits and police plans. Now they were simply hungry men thinking about catfish, conversation, and a brief pause before eating. At street level, the Lorraine looked almost ordinary, with ice machines humming and a few children cutting across the lot on their way home. Reporters lingered near parked cars, watching the balcony for movement. Some locals stood on the sidewalk and stared quietly, surprised to be this close to history. Across the street, in a rooming house that looked worn and anonymous, a man watched the balcony through a bathroom window. He He had checked sites earlier and paced the floors, listening for footsteps on wood. Now he waited against peeling walls while the light softened over Mulberry Street toward evening. Back on the balcony, King leaned over the rail and called down to Jesse Jackson, who stood near the cars in a dark turtleneck. They talked about the evening program and about the music they hoped to hear. King asked for Precious Lord to be sung slowly that night there. In the seconds before MLK's assassination, nothing on the balcony looked unusual to the people standing nearby. Ralph Abernathy remained inside, straightening his tie. Reverend Kyle stepped back toward the room, thinking about the meal waiting at his house. Someone joked about King needing a topcoat in the cool air. Then a sharp sound cracked through the early evening, cutting across the motel and the street in a single instant. People nearby first thought it might be a car backfiring. As shouts rose, they saw King collapse on the balcony, his body suddenly still against the painted concrete beneath him. On the ground below, Andrew Young and others ran toward the stairway, their shoes slapping wet concrete. A photographer lifted his camera almost on instinct. On the balcony, men pointed toward the rooming house across the street, shouting that the shot had come from there, voices tight with shock inside. Reverend Kyles rushed back to room 306, grabbed a towel, and pressed it where he thought it might help, while others knelt close. Someone called for an ambulance. Someone else ran to the motel office. Sirens in the distance grew louder as the small crowd tried to pray for strength. Across the way, the man in the rooming house pulled back from the bathroom window, gathered his things, and moved quickly toward the stairs. Neighbors heard footsteps, then a door closing, then nothing more. Within minutes, the space he had used felt empty, just another rented room above the street. The ambulance arrived, and attendants carried King carefully down the stairs, through the parking lot, and into the waiting vehicle. Friends tried to climb in with him, but most were held back. As the doors closed, they watched the ambulance pull away toward St. Joseph Hospital, lights flashing through traffic. At the hospital, doctors and nurses moved fast, wheeling the stretcher into a bright emergency room and gathering equipment. Some recognized him immediately and felt a wave of disbelief. Others only knew that a gravely injured man had arrived. They worked together in urgent silence, following practiced routines for minutes. Despite their efforts, despite medicine and skill and repeated attempts to restore what had been lost, King's injuries were beyond what they could repair. In the early evening, he lost his life there, far from the balcony. Staff stepped back from the table, exhausted, and let the news settle inside. Back at the Lorraine Motel, confusion filled the corridors and parking lot. Some people thought he had already died. Others clung to the hope that surgery might save him. Reporters phoned their editors with half-formed updates. Police lines went up around the area as investigators began asking questions nearby. At the hospital entrance, officials prepared to speak to the waiting crowd of reporters and local leaders. The announcement was brief and flat, stating that Martin Luther King Jr. had lost his life from his wounds. People standing there lowered their heads, some covering faces with their hands against air. Inside the building, aides and family friends received the news in small clusters, leaning against walls or hospital chairs. Some cried out, others went quiet, and stared at the floor. Nurses and orderlies kept working around them, tending to other patients whose emergencies had nothing to do with Memphis politics. Later, King's body was prepared for transport, covered carefully, and moved from the emergency room toward the hospital morgue. Staff members who had not taken part in the effort stood aside as the stretcher passed. For them, the hallway suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher than before that day. News of MLK's assassination traveled outward quickly from Memphis through phone calls, police radios, and newsroom wires. Television networks cut into regular programs with bulletins. Radio announcers raised their voices and then forced them down again. In living rooms, people reached for the knob and tried to understand the words. In black neighborhoods of Memphis, word arrived first through hurried shouts and phone calls, then through the evening news. On porches, families gathered as if drawn by the same unseen signal. Some people wept openly, others sat very still. Church bells rang, unplanned, as pastors unlocked sanctuary doors for prayer. In many white neighborhoods, televisions glowed in living rooms where people had not followed the strike closely. For some, the news landed as a distant tragedy involving a man they mostly knew from headlines and marches. For others, it stirred unease, fear about unrest, or quiet, genuine sorrow that night. Back at the scene of MLK's assassination, police photographers took pictures of the balcony, the rail, and the concrete walkway. Investigators marked small spots on the ground and collected items from the rooming house across the street. The motel courtyard, usually a place of greetings, felt like a frozen stage. Inside the rooms where King's team had been staying, phones rang again and again. Ralph Abernathy and other leaders struggled to reach Coretta Scott King in Atlanta, knowing that every minute mattered. When they reached her, the words were simple and heavy. She listened, then began making plans to travel. Far from Memphis, Senator Robert Kennedy learned of MLK's assassination as he campaigned for the presidency. That night in Indianapolis, he faced a crowd that had not yet heard. He told them gently the king had lost his life, spoke of grief, and urged people to choose compassion over division. In Washington, President Lyndon Johnson received the news in the White House and gathered advisors around him. He went on television later that night to call for calm and for swift passage of fair housing legislation that had stalled. His face looked lined and tired as he spoke to millions. Within King's own movement, leaders felt a mix of sorrow and practical fear. They worried that streets would erupt and that the commitment to non-violence might shatter under anger. At the same time, they promised one another quietly that the work would continue, even without the voice they trusted most. Memphis officials, aware that MLK's assassination might trigger unrest, began to plan their night accordingly. Police commanders called in additional officers and checked supplies of gas and riot gear. City leaders discussed curfews, emergency declarations, and appeals for calm. Many residents stayed close to home, unsure what would follow next. In federal offices, agents and officials began piecing together the first thin outline of what had happened in Memphis. They collected reports from local police, scanned early interviews, and sent directives about evidence handling. Files with King's name already existed in drawers. Now, new pages were added under heavy scrutiny. Across the country, in cities large and small, Black families gathered that night in living rooms, kitchens, and community centers to talk about what MLK's assassination meant. Some spoke of him as a modern prophet. Others worried aloud that nonviolence had cost too much for too little change so far. In several cities, anger spilled onto streets before midnight. Crowds formed quickly, sometimes after vigils, sometimes without speeches or planning. Storefronts associated with neglect or discrimination were targeted first. Police arrived with shields and batons, and the distance between mourning and confrontation narrowed in the glow of streetlights that night. In Memphis itself, sirens passed again and again through the night as patrol cars moved between neighborhoods. The National Guard was alerted and began to mobilize, soldiers gathering at armories and staging areas. Helicopters swept low over parts of the city. For many residents, sleep felt impossible in those hours. In Atlanta, Coretta Scott King packed quickly for the flight to Memphis, while friends and relatives gathered around her children. She moved through familiar rooms that now felt altered by absence. Practical questions pressed in about flights, security, and schedules. Underneath, there was grief and a need to move forward. Back at the Lorraine, staff and guests moved quietly between rooms, unsure whether to stay or leave. A few gathered in the courtyard for shared prayer, voices low. Others packed suitcases in silence. The motel sign still glowed against the night, but its familiar light now felt different to everyone. That night, the hours after MLK's assassination held a strange mix of motion and stillness. Phones rang and radios crackled, yet many people sat wordless on couches and church pews. The country had not yet fully reacted. It was the narrow space between a single shot and a wider storm. By the time midnight passed and the calendar turned quietly toward April 5th, the grief of that night had already begun to shift into something larger. In cities across America, people chose how to answer the loss. The days that followed would test streets, governments, and the movement itself deeply. MLK's assassination sent a shock through American cities that turned quiet grief into street-level crisis within hours. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, television and radio carried the news from Memphis into row houses, high-rise towers, and small farm kitchens. By midnight, police radios crackled with reports of crowds gathering, shop windows breaking, and sirens racing toward neighborhoods already stretched by poverty and strain. In Washington, D.C., the first hours after MLK's assassination felt fragile and tense. Clusters of young people gathered along U Street and 14th, listening to car radios and passing the news from doorway to doorway. Some leaders and ministers urged people to channel their anger into vigils and meetings, while others feared that years of mistreatment would now pour out in less controlled ways. In Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley and his commanders listened to early reports with tight faces, remembering previous summers when certain blocks had already pushed close to the breaking point. On the west side, families stepped onto stoops or leaned from apartment windows as word of MLK's assassination spread from one voice to another. Some parents pulled their children inside and locked doors, sensing trouble before the first bottle hit glass. Baltimore, already uneasy from debates over schools and housing, received news of MLK's assassination like a fresh wound on an old bruise. Teenagers who had grown up hearing King's voice on radios suddenly imagined a world without it, and their fear mixed with frustration at teachers, police, and landlords who still spoke to them with open disregard. By the next day, Baltimore streets that had seen many marches would see smoke and shattered storefronts as well. Across more than 100 American cities, the hours after MLK's assassination followed a pattern that felt both spontaneous and deeply prepared by years of neglect. Community leaders called emergency meetings, church doors opened for prayer, and at the same time, small groups moved through commercial strips, breaking windows at stores seen as symbols of exploitation. Police chiefs, mayors, and governors watched these first reports with a mix of dread and determination to show that they were still in control. In Washington, D.C., looting began along 14th Street as night deepened after MLK's assassination, and flames soon marked the route like a grim chain of beacons. Shop owners who had locked their doors earlier in the evening returned to find glass on the sidewalks and smoke pouring from broken windows. Fire trucks tried to move in, but were sometimes turned back by crowds or by the simple fact that too many fires had started at once for one city to manage. Mayor Walter Washington and federal officials watched the capital's main streets burn only blocks from federal buildings that represented national power. President Johnson ordered federal troops and the National Guard into the city, and soon soldiers in helmets and uniforms stood on corners where children usually played tag. Armored vehicles rolled past row houses, their engines rumbling as families watched through curtains, unsure whether the uniforms meant safety, danger, or both at once. In Chicago, Daley issued orders that police should use deadly force against anyone seen looting or setting fires in the wake of MLK's assassination, signaling a hard line that would echo for years. On the west side, smoke rose from stretches of Madison Street as residents moved in every direction at once, some carrying food or clothes, others simply trying to get home before curfew. National Guard troops arrived there as well, standing with rifles held across their chests, while ash floated through the air and storefront signs cracked in the heat. Baltimore's unrest began slightly later, but grew quickly, with crowds forming on Pennsylvania Avenue and North Avenue the day after MLK's assassination. As windows broke and small fires appeared, police made arrests, yet each arrest seemed to draw more onlookers who shouted at officers and threw whatever objects they could find nearby. Soon the governor called in thousands of National Guard troops and then federal soldiers, turning major intersections into checkpoints with sandbags and rifles lining the edges of the streets. Newark, Detroit, and other cities that had already seen uprisings earlier in the decade watched the news of MLK's assassination with particular dread. Officials there moved quickly to put extra officers on duty and to call clergy, neighborhood leaders, and youth workers who might help calm streets before trouble took hold. In some neighborhoods, their efforts held, leading to candlelight vigils and marches with hymns instead of broken glass, while in others, scattered damage still marked that weekend. For people living inside these neighborhoods, the days after MLK's assassination felt like standing in the center of a storm that arrived without time to prepare. Parents tried to decide whether to keep children indoors behind curtains or let them walk to school through streets lined with soldiers and burned-out storefronts. Elders shook their heads at the sight of churches standing untouched beside grocery stores with charred interiors and shelves spilled into the aisles. Many residents who never picked up a brick or broke a window still felt the weight of what was happening when they walked past armed patrols to buy bread or medicine. They watched soldiers scan rooftops, listened to the thump of helicopter blades overhead, and tried to remember everyday routines like laundry and homework in a city that no longer sounded normal. For them, the flames were not only on television, but on the corner by the bus stop and along streets they had walked since childhood. Store owners, many of them small business families who had survived lean years, stood in front of shattered windows in the mornings after MLK's assassination and tried to measure damage in both money and trust. Some had treated neighbors fairly for years and now wondered why their stores were hit, while others knew they had relied on high prices and low wages in communities with few other options. Pastors walked block by block, placing hands on shoulders, helping sweep broken glass into piles, and inviting people into churches for food, shelter, and a chance to breathe together. For police officers, the days after MLK's assassination brought long shifts and difficult choices on streets where they were often seen as symbols of the very unfairness that had sparked the anger. Some officers tried to use calm voices and steady hands, steering people away from burning buildings and warning about curfews instead of reaching first for their weapons. Others responded with quick arrests, heavy batons, and gunfire that added new injuries and deaths to nights already marked by loss. Movement veterans who had spent years teaching nonviolence watched the unrest after MLK's assassination with heavy hearts. They understood the frustration that fueled smashed windows and burning cars, yet they feared that these scenes would drown out King's patient message in many viewers' minds. In late-night meetings at churches and community centers, they pleaded for peaceful marches, prayer services, and disciplined protest as a way to honor his memory. In many white suburbs and small towns far from the burned corridors, the unrest after MLK's assassination appeared mainly on television screens, framed by living room curtains. Viewers saw images of young men running with boxes in their arms, soldiers standing beside jeeps, and buildings wrapped in smoke that turned the sky a dirty gray. Some felt compassion and worry, asking what they could do to support grieving communities, while others mainly felt fear and anger about crime and disorder. Within a few days, officials counted dozens of deaths across the country related to the unrest that followed MLK's assassination, most of them in black neighborhoods already worn by decades of neglect. Thousands were injured and tens of thousands arrested, filling jails and temporary holding centers where families waited outside with bags of clothes and sandwiches. Federal records later noted the use of many thousands of soldiers and guard members across the affected cities, making it one of the largest domestic deployments in modern American history. While cities struggled with fires and curfews, King's body was brought back to Atlanta, and plans began for services that would draw mourners from every part of the country touched by MLK's assassination. In many burned neighborhoods, people spoke of the trip to Atlanta as a kind of pilgrimage, even if they could only watch the funeral on television from crowded living rooms and church halls. Local marches and services were planned alongside, giving neighbors who could not travel a chance to walk together in grief through streets that still smelled of smoke. When the funeral procession moved through Atlanta a few days after MLK's assassination, many of the same cities that had burned fell quiet for a time. Television showed mourners walking behind a simple farm wagon carrying King's casket, and in Baltimore, Chicago, Washington, and dozens of other places, people watched with tears on their faces. Some stood in church basements with radios pressed to their ears, while others lined up in front of appliance store windows where televisions flickered behind dusty glass. In the days that followed, some cities slowly lifted curfews and sent soldiers home, while others kept tight controls in place until every last trace of smoke had cleared from the sky. On burned blocks, city trucks hauled away debris and boarded up empty buildings, leaving long rows of plywood where colorful storefronts and neon signs had once drawn evening crowds. Residents who had lost homes or jobs tried to navigate relief offices and insurance forms, discovering that recovery would be slower and more uneven than the sudden rush of destruction. For the nation, the burning and mourning after MLK's assassination left a double image of grief and fear that would not fade quickly. Some remembered the quiet rows of mourners and hymns. Others remembered soldiers on corners and streets that never fully came back again. MLK's assassination turned Memphis from a grieving city into the center of a vast manhunt, as local officers and federal agents tried to follow a single trail outward into the wider world. In the minutes after the shot, police swarmed the Lorraine Motel and the narrow streets around it, pushing back onlookers and trying to make sense of a balcony stained by sudden violence. Across the street, officers moved into the old rooming house, whose rear windows overlooked the motel. Doors were opened, hallways were searched, and in a small bathroom at the back, they found the place where many believed the sniper had stood. National Archives, not far from the building, near a storefront on South Main. A bundle lay abandoned on the sidewalk. Inside were a rifle, a scope, binoculars, and other items that looked hastily gathered and just as hastily dropped. The rifle was a Remington Game Master, a pump-action hunting gun chambered for powerful cartridges, and it would soon sit at the center of the federal case. Fingerprint powder and careful hands began their work, even as the night around the motel still echoed with sirens. Wikipedia +1 witnesses told police they had seen a white man leaving the rooming house moments after the shot and climbing into a white Ford Mustang before driving away from the neighborhood. Some remembered the way he moved, quick and focused, as if he had already rehearsed the route in his mind. Officers wrote down these details on clipboards held under streetlights that threw long shadows across the pavement. Every small description became a piece of a growing puzzle. A BC News Inside the city police headquarters that night, and in Washington soon after, there was no doubt that the search had to reach beyond Memphis. The Federal Bureau of Investigation quickly took charge, and what followed became one of the largest manhunts in its history. Agents were told to move fast, to check gun shops, car rentals, rooming houses, and old arrest files. A single set of fingerprints on that rifle and in that bathroom could tie this crime to someone already known. MLK Institute, +1. When laboratory technicians compared the prints from the rifle and the bathroom to federal records, they found a match. The name on the cards belonged to James Earl Ray, an escaped prisoner who had broken out of the Missouri State Penitentiary the year before by hiding in a bakery truck. His file showed a history of robbery, fraud, and flight, rather than steady work or family ties. Now his photograph sat on desks in field offices across the country with the words "armed and dangerous" stamped in effect across his story. Wikipedia +1. Agents also learned that Ray favored aliases and had already moved across several states since his escape. He had bought a white Mustang in Alabama under a false name and obtained an Alabama driver's license that did not belong to the man in the mugshot. He had drifted through cities in the United States and Mexico, trying different schemes and watching politics with a hard eye, drawn to segregationist figures who promised to turn back civil rights gains. The picture that formed was of a restless man, always moving, always reaching for another disguise. Wikipedia +1. From Memphis, the trail of MLK's assassination pointed first to Atlanta. Following leads on the white Mustang, authorities found the car abandoned days later in a city lot, its interior holding small traces of the man who had driven it east through the night. In a nearby rooming house, they found other items tied by prints and witness accounts back to the same name. The line from the bathroom window above Mulberry Street now bent toward the bus stations and border crossings of the wider continent. Wikipedia +1. Ray, meanwhile, stayed on the move. After leaving the Mustang in Atlanta, he traveled by bus through Cincinnati and Detroit before crossing into Canada at Windsor and heading for Toronto. In that city, he rented cheap rooms, walked crowded streets, and listened closely for any sign that the world had fixed on his face. It had. His picture hung in post offices and police stations in both countries. Yet in the anonymity of a large city, he still found ways to blend into the background for a time. Wikipedia +1. In Toronto, Ray stole the identity of a local man named Ramon Snade in order to obtain a Canadian passport. He managed this not with force, but with deception, using the phone and bits of official language to pave the way for a document that did not belong to him. When the passport was approved and handed over, he held in his hands a new name and a new chance to disappear. With that paper, the search for King's killer would no longer be limited to North America. Wikipedia, on that passport, he booked a round-trip ticket to London in early May. Observers later noted the bitter symmetry of a man wanted for taking a life stepping calmly through international terminals among tourists and business travelers. In London, he spent a few days moving between small hotels and cheap rooms, watching money run low and thinking again about his next move. The escape route that had begun in a Memphis boarding house now stretched across an ocean. Wikipedia +1. From London, Ray flew onto Lisbon, hoping to find a path toward white-ruled African countries that still practiced racial separation, places whose politics matched his own hard views. The stay there was brief and unsettled. He walked unfamiliar streets, avoided drawing attention, and ultimately decided to return to London. The dream of slipping into another continent and another life did not yet materialize, and the circle of the manhunt quietly tightened behind him. Wikipedia +1. Back in London, he lived in small rooms, under assumed names, and tried to raise money. At one point, he robbed a local bank branch, grabbing a modest sum that could keep him on the run a little longer. He also approached a newspaper correspondent, hoping to make contact with former military officers who might help him become a mercenary in distant conflicts. To investigators who later traced these steps, the moves looked both determined and desperate, the actions of a man without a real refuge. Wikipedia +1. While Ray paced London streets, the work triggered by MLK's assassination stretched across offices in Washington, Ottawa, and European capitals. The FBI circulated his description and fingerprints through international channels. Royal Canadian Mounted Police placed the name on that stolen passport onto their watch lists. Immigration and customs officers in Europe were briefed on a fugitive who might be traveling under another man's identity, with plans to vanish into countries with few extradition agreements. Wikipedia +1. On June 8th, a little more than 2 months after MLK's assassination, Ray arrived at London's Heathrow Airport, intending to fly to Brussels and from there reach southern Africa. At the counter, he handed over the Canadian passport in the name of Ramon George Snade and waited. The airline worker checking documents noted the name and, following routine, compared it against a list of people flagged by Canadian authorities. There it was, printed clearly among the warnings. Wikipedia +2. Wikipedia +2. Airport staff delayed him with small questions while security officers moved into place. When they approached, they found that he was carrying a second passport under another name, a detail that only deepened their suspicions. Within minutes, he was under arrest in a back room of the airport, searched and formally identified as James Earl Ray. The long arc from that bathroom window in Memphis to a boarding gate in London had settled at last. Wikipedia +1. News of his capture raced back to the United States, where headlines announced that the most wanted man in America had been found in an international terminal far from home. In Memphis and Atlanta, some people felt a brief measure of relief, believing that a clear suspect meant that the story would finally move toward answers. Others met the news with doubt and suspicion, already wondering whether one drifter could have shaped such a shattering moment alone. Encyclopedia Britannica +1. Extradition proceedings in Britain moved forward, watched closely by reporters and by officials who wanted the case returned to American courts as soon as possible. Ray appeared in guarded settings, wearing plain clothes and speaking little. British authorities eventually approved his return, and in July he was flown back across the Atlantic to face a charge of murder in Tennessee. Cameras recorded his movements as he was led through airports and into secure transports, silent under bright lights. National Archives +1 when he arrived in Memphis that summer. The jail that received him stood just a short drive from the Lorraine Motel, which now bore a memorial wreath on the balcony rail. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some demanding swift punishment, others carrying signs that raised questions about the investigation. Inside, lawyers studied files. Prosecutors reviewed the web of evidence from rifles to car titles, and officials weighed how to try the most famous prisoner in the country. Wikipedia +1, the manhunt that had started in the shock of MLK's assassination, ended with a guarded prisoner facing a wall of cameras and a country still divided over why King had been targeted and what his loss meant. The trail of fingerprints, false names, bus tickets, and border crossings had led to one person whose guilt would soon be settled in a courtroom, at least on paper. The deeper questions about motives, allies, and truth would move into the long arguments that waited ahead. MLK's assassination moved from the balcony and the manhunt into the quiet formality of a Memphis courtroom in 1969, where James Earl Ray stood accused of killing the most widely known civil rights leader in the country. Around him, lawyers, reporters, and officials felt the weight of a case that seemed to promise both justice and clarity to a grieving nation. Ray arrived back in Tennessee under heavy guard, moved through hallways lined with cameras, and was placed in a cell a short drive from the Lorraine Motel. Prosecutors prepared a capital case that could seek the death penalty if a jury found him guilty, while defense attorneys thought about witnesses, juror attitudes, and the political winds blowing hard across the South. The courthouse itself, with its wooden benches and tall windows, became another stage where the story of the killing would be told. At first, Ray was represented by court-appointed lawyers, but soon a prominent Texas attorney named Percy Foreman entered the case, bringing a reputation for tough bargaining and dramatic trials. Foreman studied the evidence gathered after MLK's assassination and saw a rifle, a line of travel, and fingerprints that would be difficult to explain away before a local jury. He also saw the risk that a jury inflamed by grief and politics might move quickly toward a sentence of death. Behind the scenes, Foreman pressed Ray to consider a guilty plea in exchange for life in prison, rather than a trial that could end in an execution. Ray, who had spent much of his life around prisons and escapes, weighed the choice in long conversations across a small table, sometimes insisting that he wanted his day in court, sometimes listening as his lawyer described the likely outcome. The power imbalance was clear, with legal experts and officials on one side and a restless, guarded defendant on the other. Outside the legal meetings, many Americans assumed there would be a full public trial that would explore every detail of MLK's assassination. Reporters imagined days of testimony from experts, witnesses from the rooming house, and federal agents who had followed the trail across borders. King's family and allies expected to hear how investigators understood the motives behind the killing and whether anyone else might have helped plan it. The case felt bigger than one man and one rifle to many who watched from afar. Yet in March 1969, when the case finally reached a formal hearing, events moved in a very different direction. Ray stood before the judge and entered a plea of guilty to the murder charge, signed papers that waived his right to trial, and accepted a sentence of 99 years in prison. The courtroom did not hear the long parade of witnesses that many had expected. Instead, the main details of the government's case were summarized in careful official language, and the proceeding ended quickly. For King's family, the sudden end of courtroom testimony felt like a door closing before the room had even been explored. They had hoped to see evidence tested in public and to hear officials answer questions about why the watch on King's life had not prevented the shot in Memphis. Coretta Scott King and some of King's closest colleagues expressed disappointment that there would be no jury and no chance to examine other possible threads. They accepted that a man had been punished, yet they did not feel that the full truth had been aired. Only days after his plea, Ray began to change his story. He claimed that he had been pressured into admitting guilt, that his lawyer had misled him about his chances at trial, and that he wanted to withdraw the plea and face a jury after all. Through letters and later interviews, he insisted that he had not acted alone and began to suggest that others had used him as a tool. These reversals opened a long season of doubt that would follow the official verdict for decades. Courts reviewed his attempts to withdraw the plea and found little reason to reverse it. Judges noted that he had answered questions under oath, signed the documents with full awareness of the charge, and been represented by counsel. In their view, the guilty plea remained valid, and the 99-year sentence would stand. Legal arguments about procedure moved forward in written opinions, but they did little to quiet the broader public questions that now surrounded the case. Over the years, Ray developed a shifting story of how MLK's assassination had unfolded. He spoke of a mysterious figure he called Raoul, who, he said, had guided him in buying the rifle, choosing locations, and moving along the escape route. In this version, Ray admitted to being present in Memphis and to fleeing after the shot, yet he denied pulling the trigger himself. Investigators and many historians have found no solid proof that this guiding figure existed, and the tale has often been viewed as an attempt to reduce his own responsibility. Questions about a wider plot formed quickly around MLK's assassination, and Ray's changing claims fed those suspicions. Some people wondered whether wealthy segregationists might have funded or guided the killing. Others pointed to the long record of surveillance of King by federal agencies and asked whether officials had turned a blind eye to threats or even been directly involved. Official investigations have never proven that government agencies ordered the killing. Yet the history of harassment and spying created a deep mistrust that shaped how many Americans read the case. In the late 1970s, Congress created the House Select Committee on Assassinations to reinvestigate the deaths of King and President John Kennedy. The committee studied ballistics reports, travel records, and witness testimony, and it concluded that Ray had fired the shot that killed King. At the same time, its final report suggested that there was a likelihood of a broader conspiracy involving other people who might have helped finance or support the act. This careful yet unsettling conclusion kept the official record open to layers of doubt rather than closing it firmly. Years later, a civil suit in Memphis brought still more attention to questions around MLK's assassination. The King family supported a case filed by the family of Lloyd Jowers, a local restaurant owner who claimed there had been a conspiracy involving himself and others. In that civil trial, a jury found that King had been the victim of a conspiracy that included Jowers and unnamed government agencies. A verdict reached under the lower standard of proof used in civil law. The decision did not change Ray's conviction, yet it added another official voice suggesting that more than one person had been involved. Throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Ray and his supporters repeatedly sought a new trial. At different times, prominent lawyers and writers took up his cause, arguing that fresh ballistic tests, new witness statements, or questions about the rifle's chain of custody justified another look in a criminal court. Members of the King family eventually said publicly that they believed Ray deserved a full trial, not because they were certain of his innocence, but because they felt the country needed to see all the evidence tested in open session. Courts and federal reviews examined these requests and declined to reopen the criminal case, leaving the original plea and sentence in place. Official reviews consistently returned to the same core conclusion about MLK's assassination. They held that Ray had fired the fatal shot and that whatever informal help he may have received from sympathizers did not amount to a proven, centrally directed plot. Justice Department inquiries in the late 20th century and early 21st century examined specific conspiracy claims and reported that they found no reliable evidence to support them. These findings reassured some observers, yet others felt that the absence of proof did not erase their sense that important questions remained. Inside prison walls, Ray's life followed a pattern of petitions, interviews, and occasional bursts of sudden action. In 1977, he briefly escaped from Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee, along with other inmates, slipping into the hills before being captured again after only a few days. The escape underlined how determined he remained to control his fate, even from behind high fences and bars. As the years passed, his health declined, and by the time he died in 1998, he was still officially recorded as the man responsible for King's death. Beyond the formal steps of MLK's assassination case, a wide literature of books, documentaries, and lectures grew up around the gaps people felt. Some writers argued that Ray had been part of a complex web of racists, criminals, and intelligence contacts. Others approached the case more cautiously, noting errors in the investigation or weaknesses in the handling of evidence, yet still concluding that Ray had been the gunman. Ordinary readers and viewers moved through these competing accounts and often came away with a lasting sense that something about the case remained unsettled. For many people who had marched with King or listened to his sermons on worn church pews, these legal twists were not abstract puzzles. They touched questions of trust in courts that had once upheld segregation and in agencies that had watched King as if he were a danger. Some found it easier simply to accept the official conclusion. Others lived with a quiet, enduring skepticism. In living rooms and classrooms, the story of MLK's assassination often came in two layers. One layer told of a lone gunman, a long manhunt, a guilty plea, and a life sentence, the version found in schoolbooks and official summaries. The other layer held the rumors, questions, and counter-stories that circulated through barbershops, union halls, and church basements, carried in low voices across generations. Together, verdict and doubt shaped how Americans faced King's death. That tension never fully settled. MLK's assassination left the civil rights movement stunned, but still moving. Like a march that had lost its lead drummer, yet could not simply stop in the street. In the days after Memphis, staff from SCLC, local organizers, and longtime volunteers rode buses and planes with tired eyes, carrying suit jackets in wrinkled garment bags and thick folders of notes. They attended hurried meetings in church basements and union halls, rooms where paper cups of coffee sat next to well-worn Bibles and mimeographed leaflets for marches that now felt both necessary and fragile. Every conversation circled the same questions, spoken softly in hallways thick with cigarette smoke and hymn echoes. Who would lead? What strategy could hold? And how could non-violence survive when the man most associated with it had fallen on a balcony before the eyes of the world? Grief rode beside them on every highway, yet the work pressed forward, asking for schedules, budgets, and decisions in calm voices each night. At SCLC, Ralph Abernathy stepped into the formal role of president, a close friend trying to carry work that had never been meant for one man alone. He answered calls from pastors who wanted guidance, fielded questions from reporters about plans and divisions, and listened to staff members who confessed that they did not know whether donors or volunteers would stay. Coretta Scott King, walking through her own loss, also became a steady public presence, speaking in packed churches and at peace rallies, her voice clear even when her eyes showed deep fatigue. She insisted that the best way to honor her husband was to continue his search for justice for the poor, for workers, and for those whose lives had been held down for generations. In meetings where some people called for harsh answers, she described nonviolence as a discipline that could still turn enemies into neighbors, even though its most visible teacher now lay in the ground. Her calm presence held many hearts. In Memphis itself, the days after MLK's assassination brought both mourning and a firm decision among the sanitation workers to finish what they had started. They kept marching from Claiborne Temple, carrying the same "I am a man" signs, now lifted higher, as if the cardboard could somehow bridge the distance between their grief and their demands. National union leaders and federal mediators pressed the city to recognize the union and improve wages and safety, reminding officials that the world was watching how Memphis would treat the men who carried its garbage. By late April, an agreement granted raises, union recognition, and a grievance process, and though problems did not vanish, the men walked back to work as part of a victory shaped by years of endurance and by King's final trip. Soon after, SCLC launched the Poor People's Campaign that he had planned, bringing thousands of low-income Americans to Washington to camp in a muddy encampment on the mall called Resurrection City there. Resurrection City rose from plywood, canvas, and hope, a patchwork settlement where families from small towns, reservations, and inner city blocks lived side by side in the shadow of the capital. Rain turned the ground to thick mud and left shoes caked, blankets damp, and cook fires struggling. Yet nightly meetings filled with speeches, songs, and debates about how to press the case for jobs and income. Visitors walked the wooden walkways, saw hand-lettered signs calling for dignity, and met organizers who tried to keep peace in a place where frustration and community rubbed shoulders every hour. The federal government tolerated the camp for a time, then grew impatient with the mess, the noise, and the clear reminder that hunger and joblessness lived only steps from monuments to national power. When police finally cleared Resurrection City, dismantling shelters and hauling away boards, many residents felt that the campaign had not won concrete promises, yet they also felt they had carried King's vision into form. In many cities, the months after Martin Luther King's assassination deepened a split between movement veterans who guarded nonviolence and younger activists who spoke of Black power and self-determination. Students who had grown up watching Southern campaigns now faced overcrowded schools, dying factories, and aggressive policing, and some felt that the dream of melting hatred with patient suffering had died on the balcony in Memphis. The Black Panther Party, already rising, drew new attention with armed patrols that monitored police, with free breakfasts for children, and with clinics that tested neighbors for diseases long ignored in poor districts. Many residents welcomed the Panthers as bold protectors and practical helpers, even as mayors, police chiefs, and federal agents watched them with alarm and worked aggressively to break their networks apart. Older ministers who had walked beside King often felt caught between loyalty to nonviolence and recognition that younger neighbors faced daily dangers and humiliations that pushed patience close to its breaking point. Conversations grew in church basements. Alongside the sharp debates, countless organizers quietly kept building on King's non-violent methods, adjusting them to new campaigns in schools, workplaces, and city halls. Operation Breadbasket, led in Chicago by Jesse Jackson and others, pressured grocery chains and major employers to hire more Black workers and to purchase from Black-owned suppliers, turning economic boycotts into a tool for steady community gains. Welfare rights groups, many of them organized by Black women, staged sit-ins at offices, traveled to state capitals, and calmly explained that supporting poor families was not charity, but a recognition of shared citizenship. Teachers and students walked picket lines for better textbooks, counselors, and facilities, carrying signs that quoted King and sang hymns even as police watched from nearby corners. In all of these efforts, the movement widened from a focus on Southern segregation to a fight over schools, jobs, and public services in northern and western cities, showing that King's legacy had not frozen on that balcony. It kept walking. The movement after MLK's assassination also stepped more directly into electoral politics, as activists who had once focused mainly on marches began running for office or organizing voters around city council and mayoral races. New generations of Black officials won seats in state legislatures, on school boards, and eventually in mayors' offices in cities like Cleveland, Gary, and Newark, often campaigning on promises to make government truly answerable to neighborhoods long ignored. Campaign offices doubled as community centers where volunteers registered new voters, helped elders fill out forms, and passed around leaflets that quoted King's speeches about dignity and power in the ballot. Yet even as more black leaders entered formal politics, people in poor neighborhoods learned that representation alone did not quickly fix overcrowded housing, weak schools, or the long shadow of discrimination in banks and workplaces. Movement veterans spoke of a new phase where street-level protest would need to stay alive beside patient, often frustrating work inside city budgets and committee meetings. Black churches, which had always been the movement's backbone, became even more important after MLK's assassination as places where memory, organizing, and healing intertwined week after week. Pastors rewrote sermons to include stories about King's courage and flaws, reminding congregations that he had been a human being with doubts and weariness who kept going despite threats. Choirs sang older spirituals alongside newer songs that mentioned mountains, dreams, and freedom, turning sanctuary air into a living archive of movement history. Church basements hosted legal clinics, tutoring programs, food pantries, and voter education sessions, with folding tables crowded by paperwork and pencil shavings, and pots of soup simmering in corner kitchens. In these spaces, the movement's focus stretched beyond desegregating buses and lunch counters towards sustaining whole communities, so that children growing up after King's death would know his message not only from textbooks, but from the way neighbors cared for one another. Elders quietly repeated his stories in pews, porches, and crowded living rooms at night. For young people coming of age after MLK's assassination, the movement was both a living presence and a fading photograph, something they touched in rallies and also inherited as legend. On college campuses, students formed Black student unions, demanded courses in African and African American history, and occupied administrative offices with lists of demands taped to doors. Many pinned posters of King beside images of Malcolm X and newer leaders, trying to understand how calls for non-violent love and calls for self-defense might fit together inside one life. Youth programs used his birthday, even before it became a national holiday, as a day for projects, speeches, and neighborhood cleanups, giving teenagers a chance to practice leadership with clipboards, paint rollers, and microphones. At the same time, many young people looked at stubborn poverty, police violence, and the wars abroad, and wondered whether the sacrifices of the older generation had really changed the structure of power. Their questions pushed elders to rethink the story itself. Over time, the movement shaped by MLK's assassination did not end so much as change shape, bending through victories, losses, and long quiet stretches. Some organizations closed their doors, some split over strategy, and new groups appeared with fresh names, but the same old insistence that dignity, fair pay, and equal protection were rights, not favors. In city buildings and small offices, people carried worn photographs of King in wallets and folders, reminders that their petitions, speeches, and negotiations were part of a longer moral line. At the neighborhood level, his memory lived in tenant meetings that refused to back down, parents' committees that stayed late to read test scores, and workers who quietly signed cards to start new unions. Step by step, these efforts prepared the ground for later changes in law and policy, even when the people involved felt tired, overlooked, and unsure of their own impact. In years ahead, those shifts would touch courts, schools, workplaces, and the country's sense of fairness. MLK's assassination came at a turning point where grief in the streets met debates in Congress and state houses over what kind of power the United States would use inside its own borders. In the weeks after the murder, television images of burning neighborhoods and soldiers on American streets pressed lawmakers to act, and they moved toward a fair housing bill that had stalled again and again under pressure from property interests and fearful voters. President Lyndon Johnson, who had already pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, went on television to link the loss in Memphis with the need to outlaw racial discrimination in housing. And many members of Congress understood that doing nothing would send a bleak message to the country. Within days, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, often called the Fair Housing Act, which made it illegal to refuse to sell or rent a home because of race, color, religion, or national origin, and later expanded to cover sex, disability, and families with children. For families who had been steered away from certain neighborhoods by real estate agents, denied loans by banks, or blocked by violence and threats when they tried to move across invisible color lines, the law put federal weight behind their right to seek a home wherever they could afford one. Yet the Fair Housing Act arrived with narrow exemptions, limited enforcement tools, and a political climate that made many officials hesitant to press hard against landlords, lenders, or local customs. So the gap between rights on paper and daily reality remained stubborn in many cities. MLK's assassination also unfolded in a broader moment when federal power in civil rights was shifting from breaking down formal segregation toward wrestling with deeper questions of economic inequality and local control. The Great Society programs that Johnson had championed poured money into schools, health clinics, and anti-poverty projects. Yet they also faced backlash from taxpayers who felt overwhelmed, from white neighborhoods that resented new attention to black communities, and from critics who said that Washington was trying to manage problems it did not fully understand. After MLK's assassination, political leaders understood that the country was anxious about both unrest and change, and the 1968 presidential campaign quickly turned those anxieties into arguments about law and order, social programs, and who would decide how power was used in American neighborhoods. Richard Nixon spoke of restoring calm, appealing to what he called a silent majority that was uneasy with protests, riots, and rapid cultural change, while George Wallace ran on a harder message that mocked civil rights gains and promised to let police act with fewer restraints. For many white voters who had watched King's marches with mixed feelings and who now saw both his loss and the burning blocks that followed, the promise of law and order sounded safer than the language of justice. and the political map of the country began to realign around those fears. Congress also passed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which created new streams of federal money for local police departments and built a national system for training, equipment, and data that made law enforcement more visible and more heavily armed in many communities. Over the following decade, federal grants paid for radios, patrol cars, new tactics, and crime laboratories, while city budgets increasingly treated policing and prisons as central tools for managing urban strain rather than focusing as heavily on housing, jobs, and youth programs. MLK's assassination had highlighted poverty and injustice in glaring light, yet many of the policy responses that followed emphasized control more than opportunity, and the early language of a war on crime began to grow beside earlier wars on hunger and unemployment. At the same time, the federal government's intelligence agencies expanded efforts to monitor and disrupt groups they saw as threats, a process that had already targeted King and now turned toward Black Power organizations, anti-war networks, and sometimes even local leaders whose main work was registering voters or organizing tenants. Investigations in later decades would reveal how domestic surveillance programs gathered files on activists, tapped phones, and tried to sow distrust inside movements, shaping a climate in which many people who carried on King's work felt that they lived under a constant, unseen watch. In the legal system, MLK's assassination did not stop the Supreme Court from advancing civil rights cases, but it did change the context in which those decisions were received, as orders for school desegregation and later for busing met a wave of resistance that blended concerns about children with coded language about neighborhoods and race. When federal courts ordered districts to redraw lines or move students in order to create more balanced schools, many white families answered by moving to suburbs, opening private academies, or fighting the plans through local elections and court appeals. And the result was that Black children often found themselves riding buses past largely white schools, only to attend other buildings where poverty and need were still concentrated. Affirmative action policies grew in this same era, with federal orders requiring government contractors and universities to take active steps to include Black applicants and other underrepresented groups, and supporters often invoked King's memory as they argued that opportunity could not be real if institutions simply claimed to be colorblind while leaving old patterns intact. Opponents answered with their own readings of his words, quoting his hope that children would be judged by character and not by skin color, as they argued that any consideration of race in school, admissions, hiring, or contracting was itself unfair, and these disagreements over how to use his legacy played out in courtrooms, legislatures, and ballot initiatives for decades. Enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, which King had helped to win, continued after MLK's assassination through Justice Department lawsuits and federal examiners who monitored elections in places with long histories of suppression. And those efforts helped open the way for thousands of Black officials at the local, state, and eventually national level. Black mayors took office in cities like Cleveland, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, often campaigning with King's words in their speeches and promising to use city halls that had once ignored black neighborhoods to address police practices, housing, and jobs, even though they inherited budgets and economies that limited how far they could move. Federal civil rights lawyers used the tools created in the 1960s to bring cases against discriminatory employers, school districts, and eventually police departments. And over time, they negotiated agreements that required agencies to change hiring, promotion, and use of force policies, drawing a direct line from the marches King led to the regulations that governed officers on patrol. Even as these legal tools grew sharper, the economic ground under many black and working-class communities shifted in painful ways. As factories closed, oil shocks and inflation squeezed family budgets, and city governments, facing shrinking tax bases, cut services in neighborhoods that had just begun to see new investments. In the 1980s, federal leaders who praised King's call for individual responsibility also pushed through tax cuts, reductions in welfare programs, and a tougher stance on crime, and many poor families experienced that mix of honor and retrenchment as a message that their hero's name could be spoken, while the structures that held them down stayed in place. Drug policy became another arena where the direction of American power after MLK's assassination could be felt, as new laws created long sentences for possession and distribution. Police conducted more aggressive sweeps in poor neighborhoods, and prison populations climbed sharply, with black men far more likely to be locked in cells than their share of the population would suggest. King had spoken near the end of his life about the danger of allowing violence, despair, and prison to swallow young people who saw no future. And in the decades after his death, many pastors, lawyers, and organizers tried to carry that warning into work on bail reform, sentencing, and re-entry, even when the larger tide of policy was still flowing toward punishment. Abroad, MLK's assassination complicated the image American officials tried to project. Yet over time, his story became part of the country's soft power, as diplomats and presidents cited him in speeches about democracy and human rights, while visitors from other nations walked past his memorials and learned about the campaigns he led. Activists in South Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and beyond studied his speeches alongside their own traditions, and sometimes quoted his words in their struggles. And American leaders who visited those regions found that talking about King and the movement that had surrounded him could open doors even when other parts of US policy were viewed with anger or suspicion. Inside the United States, the laws and policies that followed MLK's assassination created a double legacy, one in which expanded protections against discrimination sat beside rising budgets for police and prisons, and one in which King's name was used both by those seeking more generous investments and by those arguing that the best way to honor him was to treat everyone the same under rules that did not always account for history. Decades after the balcony in Memphis, the direction of American power that followed MLK's assassination could be traced in school districts still arguing over lines, in courtrooms hearing challenges to voting rules, in city councils debating police budgets, and in federal offices deciding whether to bring civil rights cases or to stand back and let local authorities rule. In each setting, people argued about safety, fairness, and responsibility, and whether the country would lean toward control or toward care as it tried to answer the questions his life and death had left behind. Quietly, that choice shaped how millions experienced justice, hope, and the daily reach of government. MLK's assassination has been remembered in the United States through funerals, memorials, a national holiday, and quiet rituals that stretch from Atlanta to small towns far from Memphis. In the first days after the shooting, the country watched the long procession in Atlanta, a simple farm wagon carrying King's casket through streets lined with mourners. Those images settled deep in the national memory, a sea of people walking in silence past brick houses and churches while bells tolled. For many, that funeral became the first monument, not in stone, but in the way people carried his story inside their own grief. In the months that followed Martin Luther King's assassination, Coretta Scott King worked to turn memory into something lasting and organized. She founded the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, which many people simply call the King Center. Its purpose was to preserve his papers, teach his philosophy, and support ongoing campaigns for peace and justice. Visitors who walked through its halls saw photographs of marches, letters he had written under strain, and films of speeches that had once crackled through radios. Outside, the tomb where King and later Coretta would rest turned their resting place into a site of pilgrimage, a space where water, stone, and words invited visitors to stand quietly and consider what their lives might add to his unfinished work. In Memphis, the Lorraine Motel itself slowly shifted from an ordinary business into a site of remembrance shaped by MLK's assassination. For years, the rooms remained, the balcony preserved with a wreath near the spot where King had collapsed. People came to stand in the parking lot, look up at the rail, and feel the strange pull of seeing a place that looked both everyday and heavy. Efforts grew to protect the building from demolition and to turn it into a museum that would tell the wider story of civil rights. Eventually, the National Civil Rights Museum opened there, connecting King's life and death to a broader journey from slavery through Jim Crow to modern struggles, and visitors walked from the slave decks of exhibits to the final rooms that looked out over the balcony, tracing a line from the nation's earliest violence to that single evening in Memphis. Across the country, cities and counties answered MLK's assassination by renaming streets, schools, and public buildings in his honor. In many black neighborhoods, the new signs felt like long overdue recognition, a way of placing his name where children would see it each day on the way to class or the store. In some places, the decisions came easily at city council meetings, where residents spoke with one voice. In others, there were sharp debates as business owners or white homeowners resisted, saying they wanted to keep older names or feared that a new name would change how outsiders viewed their area. Over time, more than 1,000 streets took his name, often in corridors that had seen redlining, disinvestment, and unrest. And the pattern meant that for many Americans, Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard or Avenue marks both honor and the unfinished work of equal investment. Schools also became sites where MLK's assassination was remembered and reinterpreted. Textbooks in the 1970s and 80s often focused on his "I Have a Dream" speech and the March on Washington, presenting him primarily as a gentle advocate of harmony and legal equality. Lessons sometimes gave less attention to his later work on poverty, labor rights, and opposition to war, and they often mentioned his death in only a few brief sentences at the end of a chapter. Teachers in many communities stretched beyond those pages, bringing in recordings of speeches against the Vietnam War or sermons about economic justice, so that students would see that his dream included housing, wages, and courage in the face of state violence. From classroom to classroom, the balance between comfort and challenge shifted, and the way children learned about him shaped how they understood the meaning of that balcony in Memphis. Soon after Martin Luther King's assassination, supporters began to talk about a national holiday in his honor as another form of living monument. Coretta Scott King, union leaders, civil rights groups, and members of Congress introduced proposals arguing that a federal day of remembrance would recognize not only a single man, but a movement that had forced the country to live closer to its stated ideals. Year after year, the bill stalled. Some lawmakers said that another holiday would cost too much in lost work. Others resisted more quietly, uncomfortable with honoring a figure who had challenged war, racism, and poverty. Outside the chambers, supporters built a cultural campaign, gathering signatures, holding rallies, and using music to reach people who might never read a bill. Stevie Wonder's song celebrating King helped turn the push for the holiday into something people could hum and dance to, carrying the demand into radio stations and living rooms. The legislative struggle that followed MLK's assassination lasted more than 15 years. Petitions with millions of signatures arrived in Washington. Cities and states created their own observances even without federal action. Finally, in 1983, Congress passed a bill establishing Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a federal holiday, and President Ronald Reagan signed it into law, with the first national observance set for 1986. The moment brought celebrations and a sense of vindication to those who had marched and written for so long. Yet acceptance was not universal. Some states delayed adopting the holiday or tried to pair it with tributes to other figures in ways that softened its focus on civil rights. Debates in places like Arizona became national news, and boycotts put pressure on officials who resisted. By the year 2000, every state finally observed the holiday, though the form and local meaning still varied. Over time, the holiday linked to MLK's assassination shifted from a day of simple remembrance toward what many called a day of service. In the 1990s, legislation and advocacy encouraged Americans to treat the day as a time for volunteering, community projects, and practical acts of care. The King Center and many local groups promoted this idea, saying that King had not sought monuments for himself, but a transformed society. On each January observance, volunteers painted schools, cleaned parks, visited prisons, and organized food drives, wearing shirts and buttons with his image and phrases from his speeches. For some, the service approach created a living memorial that connected memory with action. For others, it raised questions about whether one day of projects could substitute for deeper changes in policy and power. The tension between symbolic honor and structural change became part of how the holiday itself was debated. Physical memorials continued to grow in the decades after MLK's assassination. In Atlanta, the neighborhood around Ebenezer Baptist Church evolved into a national historical site, linking his boyhood home, the church, and the King Center into a single landscape of memory. In Washington, planners and artists worked for years to design a memorial on the National Mall. When it opened in 2011, visitors walked between tall stone pieces toward a statue of King emerging from a central block, surrounded by quotations engraved in the walls. The setting placed him among presidents and wars in the capital's symbolic heart. Some praised the way the memorial made his presence unavoidable for tourists and students. Others debated details like wording on particular quotes and the way his image was carved, showing that even stone monuments could become subjects of discussion about how to portray his resolve and humanity. Beyond official sites, MLK's assassination lived on in culture through films, songs, murals, and sermons. Artists painted his face on brick walls, sometimes beside scenes from marches or alongside portraits of other figures from Black freedom struggles. Filmmakers created documentaries that traced his life from Montgomery to Memphis, often including long stretches of audio from less familiar speeches, so that viewers could hear his growing focus on economic justice and war. Musicians sampled his words, weaving them into hip-hop tracks or gospel arrangements that reached young listeners who might not sit through a full lecture. Writers used characters who remembered where they were when they heard the news from Memphis, letting that memory shape entire novels. Through these works, the story of the balcony, the motel, and the crowded funeral kept reaching new ears. Political debates also turned repeatedly to MLK's assassination and to the way King's words should guide policy. Figures across the spectrum quoted his dream of a nation where children would be judged by character rather than skin color. Some used that line to argue for colorblind approaches that avoided race-based remedies. Others replied that King had also spoken of specific harms and the need for targeted repair. Modern movements against police violence and mass incarceration often carried his image on posters beside names of people lost in recent years, drawing a line from the dogs and batons of his time to phone videos of traffic stops gone wrong. In rallies and essays, younger activists sometimes questioned whether the public had softened him into a harmless figure and worked to recover the sharper edges of his challenge to economic and military power. In families, churches, and classrooms, MLK's assassination is still remembered in smaller, more private ways that never reach the news. Grandparents tell children where they were when the bulletin came over the radio. Teachers light candles in art projects or invite students to write letters to King as if he could still read their hopes and fears. Congregations hold January services that mix grief with instruction, asking how to love enemies without surrendering to injustice. People stand each year at the Lorraine, the King Center, or the memorial on the Mall, and let the quiet of those places work on them. Through these personal acts, the memory of one life and one balcony keeps shaping how Americans think about justice, loss, and duty. That shared memory sets the stage for how MLK's assassination continues to live inside the country's daily choices and long conversations. MLK's assassination remains in American life as a date, a place, and a wound that people keep returning to when they talk about justice and change. It is a balcony in Memphis, a wreath on a rail, a patch of pavement where friends once pointed across the street in shock. It is also a story that keeps unfolding in quieter ways, inside laws, holidays, arguments, and the choices people make with almost no cameras watching. For some Americans, that spring evening marks the end of a hopeful season when they believed that patient marching might slowly turn the country toward fairness. For others, it is a warning about how hard power will push back when old hierarchies feel threatened. Most do not carry detailed timelines in their minds, yet they carry scenes and phrases that shape how they see protests, police lines, and the word non-violence today. In that way, his death lives inside days. People who were adults when MLK's assassination took place often describe the shock the way older relatives once described hearing that a president had been shot. They remember where they were standing, which voice on the radio first told them, how the air in the room seemed to thin while the words sank in. Some recall seeing their parents cry for the first time, or watching pastors fumble for language that could hold both anger and a call to calm. Many say that was the evening they realized that doing right did not guarantee safety, and that even the most careful leader could be taken without warning. People who were children then usually remember the mood more than the details, the way teachers spoke softly, the way school assemblies felt heavier, the way sirens seemed to run all night. Their later lives have carried that early lesson about how fragile hope can feel. It stayed. Younger generations meet MLK's assassination mostly through photographs, video clips, and the way older voices pause when they reach that point in the story. In classrooms, the balcony often appears for a moment on a projector screen, one slide among many. Yet the image of the rail, the parking lot, and the men pointing still holds attention. Some students lean forward when they hear about the threats and the decision to keep traveling anyway, as if they are measuring their own courage against a man they know only in grainy sound. Others mainly remember the list of dates, laws, and names they must memorize, and the balcony sits in their minds beside tests and essays instead of beside decisions about how to live. Even so, when they see protest marches on their own screens, many quietly compare the faces and slogans to the ones they learned about from that spring in Memphis. They feel echoes. MLK's assassination shapes how Americans argue about protest, especially when marches turn tense or when windows break and fires rise on city blocks. Some point back to his commitment to nonviolence and say that any damage to property betrays his legacy, that real courage stands calmly in the path of harm without throwing a stone. Others answer that he died while supporting workers who had already faced tear gas and police clubs, and that non-violence for him was never the same as passivity or silence. In town halls and family kitchens, his name comes up when people ask whether it is better to kneel quietly to march loudly, or to withdraw their labor from systems that depend on their hands. He does not give easy answers there, but his life offers a picture of someone who kept returning to hard places long after he knew how real the danger had become. That picture still guides. In recent movements against police violence, people carry his image on posters while they chant the names of those killed in traffic stops, on sidewalks, or inside their own apartments. Some marchers quote his dream speech, using its hopeful rhythm to remind crowds that they stand in a long river of struggle that did not end in 1968. Others point to his speeches about the Vietnam War and about poverty, hearing in them a sharp criticism of systems that spend more on weapons than on schools, more on punishing than on healing. When officials tell protesters to be more polite or patient, many hear an echo of the voices he answered from his jail cell, the ones that valued order more than justice. On news panels and in city halls, people quote him to defend patience, to demand urgency, or to show that their own plans stand somewhere inside his wide vision for the present. MLK's assassination also lingers in the way Americans think about safety, leadership, and the risks that come with standing too far out in front of a crowd. Parents who remember King's death sometimes hesitate when their children talk about organizing, as if they can still feel the late-night phone calls and broken windows that often went with the work. At the same time, his memory draws many people toward public roles they might otherwise avoid because they have seen how much one voice can matter, even when it shakes the ground beneath it. City councils, school boards, and neighborhood groups often include members who say that they stepped forward after hearing his speeches or studying the campaigns that carried him to that balcony. For them, the danger feels real, yet staying quiet feels heavier, and his choice to keep moving through threats steadies them when they decide how public their own voices should be. Questions around MLK's assassination also shape how Americans think about government, truth, and the limits of official answers. Many people accept the basic findings about the manhunt and the guilty plea, yet they still feel a quiet unease, a sense that someone has not told them everything. For some, that feeling grows into detailed theories about plots and hidden sponsors, stories that move from barber chairs to late-night radio shows and long shelf rows of books. Others simply carry a general distrust that reaches far beyond Memphis, a belief that powerful institutions will always protect themselves first and tell the public only what serves that goal. In a country that relies on juries, elections, and shared facts, this mix of official reports and lingering suspicion affects how people respond to later investigations, from local scandals to national tragedies. Each new inquiry arrives in a landscape partly shaped by debates that began with that balcony. On each January holiday that honors him, MLK's assassination hovers quietly behind school assemblies, prayer breakfasts, and volunteer projects, even when people do not speak about the motel by name. Children make posters with his face. Adults sit at round tables in hotel ballrooms listening to guest speakers. And many people take the day to catch up on rest or chores. Across those different settings, the same question sits nearby. asking whether one day of words and service can match the scale of the loss and the changes he pressed for. Some treat the day mainly as a welcome break, and the balcony becomes a distant image that passes across a television screen while they fold laundry or check messages. Others plan months ahead for youth programs, neighborhood cleanups, or voter drives, using the date as a yearly checkpoint where they can measure whether their town is moving closer to the promises he named. Gently. Physical places linked to MLK's assassination also work on people in ways they do not always expect. Visitors who stand in front of the Lorraine often speak in low voices, as if the parking lot were a kind of open-air sanctuary, even though the buildings around it carry the noise of daily life. They look up at the balcony, notice the small size of the rooms behind it, and imagine voices moving through open doors and along the railing on that last afternoon. At the memorial in Washington, people walk past carved stones and read lines drawn from sermons and speeches, some familiar and some new, and they test those phrases against the country they know from their own streets. Every such visit becomes its own small negotiation between admiration and discomfort, between pride in the progress since his time and awareness of the distance that remains. In those spaces, memory keeps asking questions. MLK's assassination will always be a loss that cannot be repaired, yet the way Americans carry it helps decide what grows in the space that loss left behind. Each time someone teaches his story with care, each time a worker risks a job to speak up, each time a community chooses to meet fear with organized courage, the balcony tilts a little less toward despair. Each time anger explodes without direction, each time injustice is accepted as unchangeable, each time his name is used only to quiet the troubled and never to trouble the comfortable, the wound feels sharper again. Most of the work of living with this history does not happen on stages or under marble statues, but in patient choices to listen, to organize, to question, and to stay present when change is slow. In those quiet decisions, people choose whether his story is only grief or also a map toward repair together.